New book, Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. Marc Raimandi is here. And Garrett Gonzalez from Wrestling Observer newsletter, making his Talk is Jericho debut as well. Lots to talk about, Mark. First and foremost, I really enjoyed the book. What made you decide to write a book about such a huge time in pro wrestling, shall we say?
I would say it probably goes back like many years to just being a wrestling fan as a kid and consuming a lot of wrestling from like the age of 5 through the 90s. I'm a 90s kid. I was born in 84. I'm 40. So, I was like obsessed with wrestling in the 90s as a kid. And, as an adult, I've gotten back into it quite a bit after a little bit of a lull. And I'm so fascinated by what you guys do, by the art of wrestling, by the sociology of wrestling. And I really feel like, and I hope you can back me up on this, Chris, but I really feel like if you know about wrestling, you can see it in a lot of different places. You can see it really in many different mediums, not just wrestling. You can see it like in sports media, you can see it in music, you can see it in art. You really see the influence that wrestling has had. So I've always felt that way, and I've always like told my friends, and some of them probably wanted to strangle me because I've said it so many times, that everything is wrestling. Wrestling is everywhere if you pay attention. If you really know what you're seeing and you're receptive to it, you can see wrestling in everything. So I've had that mentality, but I didn't really know how to like express that in any way. And then so I work for ESPN. I've been with ESPN for 6 years, and for most of those 6 years I did combat sports, mostly the UFC, some wrestling, some boxing. And in 2019, the nWo got inducted into, at least it was announced that the nWo was going to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I was assigned that article for ESPN.com. I interviewed Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan, and I wrote a story about it. And I put probably a lot more like, heart and soul into that story than maybe most people would have. It could have been just a very quick, like, hey, they're going to the Hall of Fame type of deal. But I like kind of overwrote it, probably wrote like 2,000 words or more about it. And then a year and a half later, I get an email from an editor from Simon & Schuster. And you've written many books, Chris, so this is a crazy process, right? And yeah. I just got a cold email from this editor, and I'm sitting in Houston, Texas. I'm covering a UFC fight that week, right? So I'm in Houston, and I get this email from someone who says they're an editor asking me if I want to write a book about the nWo, and I'm like, this is bullshit. Like, there's no way this is real. I thought like it was maybe a Nigerian prince trying to steal my money. I didn't think that. That's a crazy email to get right on a random Thursday afternoon. Right. So I'm like, so I start Googling this guy's name. Like, hey, is this legit? Is this guy real? And it turns out that he was. And we talked on the phone that day, me and the editor from Simon & Schuster, and we really connected like right away about like our vision for what wrestling is, how the nWo influenced things, and then it was just a matter of kind of like getting my what together to try to write a book, because I have a full-time job writing for ESPN. And again, as you know, Chris, a book is a hell of an undertaking. So then it was just kind of like off to the races, and that was 4 years ago, and now the book came out on Tuesday. So it's been a pretty crazy few years.
Garrett, obviously you've been involved with wrestling media for years and years and years, and you kind of helped set up this interview today. What is your opinion on the nWo and its still, everlasting influence? Because even as Mark mentions in the book, people are still wearing nWo shirts. You see the Wolfpack stuff all over the place still to this day. Why do you think that is?
I think it's something that resonated with the fan base at a time when wrestling was at its most popular pop culturally. From a business standpoint, WWE and AEW's business is so strong, but from a pop culture perspective back in the late 90s, that stuff was just everlasting.
Yeah.
And what's funny is Mark writes a story in the book about how the rise of the nWo, when that angle happened, that WCW's business wasn't able to take advantage of it. Like, they didn't have like all the shirts ready to sell. And it's funny because I remember I was at an indie show in the Bay Area, and they were selling bootleg nWo shirts. I was like, oh, like this is the only way I'm going to be able to get one. But yeah, Chris, back to your question, it's just really like, think of all of the things from the late 90s that we still remember or that get redone or recreated musically. I share this with my stepdaughter every day when she shows me a new song, and I'm like, oh yeah, like they took the beat from this song 20 years ago. Listen to this. And she goes, I don't hear it at all, like that kind of thing. But like that, to go from that popularity, like I mean, when I saw Austin and Rock and Hogan and then Jericho comes over, like that time of wrestling was people were walking and talking about it, when in a younger time they would know Hogan and that was it. And so I think that's the reason why, like, we're talking.
I think what you said, Garrett, not to cut you off, but you mentioned how, business right now is so huge in pro wrestling with both AEW and WWE, but that crossover pop culture appeal is not the same. When you go back to this time frame, because this once again is pre-Austin, nWo became more than just an act in a wrestling show. It was everywhere. It was in colleges, and it was in movies, and it was in Hot Topics and Spencer's and all that sort of thing. It's something we don't really have in this day and age, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, even you saying Spencer's Gifts, I think that probably Garrett's stepdaughter has no idea what that is, right? That's something like from a far gone time. But it was, to me, like the nWo was so big even now, right? Because in the early 90s, it was, if you're a fan of wrestling, it's not the coolest thing to be a fan of wrestling, like in the early 90s, right? It's not,
Right.
you're not really promoting that you're a big wrestling fan, at that stage. Maybe if you're a kid. But when the nWo started, it really brought like this cool factor that did not exist prior. And especially compared to what was going on in the WWF right at that time in like 95, 96, where it's like TL Hopper, the wrestling plumber out there, like the Goon, the Body Donnas, it's like these very cartoony gimmicks. And the nWo comes in, and it is so real and organic and authentic looking. And it really changed the game as far as like the cool factor. All of a sudden, like if you're at school as a kid, it's like you almost have to know what's going on Nitro and on Raw, because that's what all the cool kids are talking about, because the nWo made things, so much like, more hip, I guess, than what was the previous content.
I really enjoyed kind of going through the whole thing, because I was there. I started in WCW in August of 96, I believe, maybe July of 96, fairly early into the whole nWo experience. So I liked kind of the history, which I knew, but going back to how WCW was this struggling company, and then Bischoff takes it over kind of as a lark almost for the TBS company, and then he brings in Hogan, and then we find out that Hogan is kind of losing his appeal. But the guarantees are there. And Garrett, you can jump in too, because I know you guys did a show on Wrestling Observer. I did not listen to it specifically because I wanted everything to be fresh here. But let's just kind of go through the origin of the nWo. And something that I think people forget is that Hogan was kind of on a downswing and was not cool anymore. And people were kind of showing that. So this was a whole resurgence, not just for the company, not just for for Hall and Nash, but for Hulk Hogan as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Mike.
I mean, it was like you're right about that, and it was a situation where you could feel the crowd changing against Hulk Hogan to an extent. Some boos, but also the worst thing that you could possibly have as a wrestler, indifference, and that's like probably the scariest thing for him was that the reactions just weren't even there for for good or bad, and that's probably terrifying. So it was a matter of like what does he do? How can he reinvent himself? Because if you're Hulk Hogan, the formula always worked, right? For a decade, the formula always worked. Hulkamania, say your vitamins, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, the whole spiel, right? And it was popular. It was over. He was the most recognizable wrestler in the history of the business at that point, right? So you can understand from a human perspective why you just want to keep going into the well, right? Keep doing the blueprint over and over again. But and Bischoff went to him in 95 and asked him, what do you think about, knowing what was going on with the crowd and seeing the numbers and the metrics, he pitched him the idea, like, what about going heel? And Hogan pretty much like threw him out of his house at that point in 95 because he just wasn't ready to do it. And he didn't see the vision. And, Hall and Nash come in and that's a big angle right off the bat. Hall coming down, in Macon, Georgia from the stands. And, Hogan is watching this. Jimmy Hart is sending him like VHS tapes on via FedEx because he's doing a movie in LA in Calabasas. And Hogan's watching it and he's seeing how over this is getting. And I think it was that really like put the idea in his head, like, maybe I can also kind of ride this wave. I can insert myself into this and make it bigger. And I can kind of cure the ailing situation with my character at that point. So I think that was like a huge deal that, what was he going to do? Because that was a real issue. Like, how was Hogan going to take this? And they ended up creating magic.
The thing about pre-NWO, they did this little test with Hogan's character. I think this was late 95 where he's all in black. Like he's not wearing the red and yellow anymore. And
really?
And I think it was probably because he was starting to get booed. Flair, he would, if you watch the early days of Nitro, Hogan and Flair wrestled so often, and Flair's getting cheered a lot. And so there was this, like, it was almost like it was a test of Hogan himself to go like, okay, what if I came in with like this darker look and had a little bit more of like an edge to me? But then he went away for a while. Like he and Savage were doing stuff at one of the pay-per-views and that Triple Doom of Terror cage match or whatever that was. Mm-hmm. But then Savage and Flair actually get hot. And so you start to see a little bit of like, oh, like people are starting to take notice of this program. House shows are up, and then, they're Nitro and Raw are competitive. And it's like, that's like the precursor to the NWO. And I think people often forget that Savage and Flair storyline actually was what was resonating with the fan base, which is kind of interesting because they had already done the Hogan and Flair stuff. And now you bring Savage in, and Savage and Flair is actually having a great increase on business pre-NWO. So yeah, there's a lot of factors for Hogan, I'm sure, back then to go, like the thing that I've been doing that has worked all my life is actually not working right now. What is the reason and what is the pivot? Obviously now in hindsight, you're like, oh yeah, turn heel. Like that's obviously the pivot. But to him back then, I imagine it wasn't just an easy kind of thing to figure out at that point.
One thing that Kevin Sullivan told me, guys, is that he felt like that if Hogan was going to come back as a babyface and go up against Hall and Nash, Kevin Sullivan believed that Hogan did not think that was going to be a beneficial arrangement for him, because he didn't think that, at least in Kevin Sullivan's, in his mind, his theory was that Hogan didn't think that those guys were going to do good business with him, that they weren't going to bump for him, that they weren't going to make him look good at matches, right? If he was going to come in as a babyface against a heel, Hall and Nash. So that maybe was one of the factors as well. That's Kevin Sullivan's theory, the late great Kevin Sullivan, of course. So I think that maybe there's something to that as well.
Well, not to mention too, though, I mean, I know what it was like to be a babyface at that time. Hogan would have been decimated by the fans because the NWO was so cool. Mm-hmm. To this day, we still use the term cool heel. You don't want to be a cool heel because you're just bearing your baby faces as well. And that's exactly what the NWO was, to the detriment of WCW. You mentioned this, Mark, and you guys talked about it, I'm sure, Garrett, how WCW became the uncool kind of job squad within their own company. Like no one wanted to be a WCW fan because the NWO was so cool when they first arrived and started to take over everything.
Yeah, I guess that's the one thing about like giving a group, a heel group, a big push like that. It's gonna be to the detriment of somebody, and it ended up being to the detriment of like every babyface in WCW.
Yeah.
What's a great part of the book that I don't even know if I realized it because Brian Alvarez has a book, but that came out, I don't know, 3 or 4 years after WCW had died. There's another book called Nitro. So this story has been out there. But what I like about Mark's book is he's got, 20 some odd years of context to go back and go, right, what did this mean to the culture? And one of the most fascinating things was you write, Mark, about how Hogan was kind of like trying to, I'm going to age myself here, but he was swagger jacking the NWO in a sense with Hall and Nash, right? Because those were the cool guys. Yes, right. And Hogan was like trying to lean into that and get some for himself. And they noticed and they were like, Well, it just helps us. It helps our group if he does become cooler, so we'll let him. But then that may be turned into a little bit of a conflict later after maybe they didn't get along so well anymore.
Yeah, and if you just look at Hogan, even like the Hulkamania era Hogan, he took so much stuff from, you know, Dusty Rhodes, Superstar Billy Graham, so many of his predecessors, right? So it was in his, you know, character kind of to borrow or whatever. And you know, it's wrestling, so that kind of stuff happens and it's not a huge deal. But certainly during the NWO era when he came out with like, you know, the 5 o'clock shadow, that was like Scott Hall's thing. That was like, you know, that was his thing. And then
Right.
at one point he had like Hollywood's Wolfpack on his boots. And, you know, Waltman and Hall and Nash were like, "Well, hold on, we're the Wolfpack. Like, we're not Hollywood's Wolfpack. Like, let's take it easy over here." But I mean, he was trying to learn from those guys. You know, I think in earnest in many cases, like how to really be a heel in the mid '90s because it was such a foreign concept to him. And you know, for the most part, he figured it out. But it did maybe take some of that, you know, aforementioned swagger jacking, Garrett.
But that's also what happened too, though, because like you mentioned, there was a whole new kind of society, you know, mindset for society in that if you were you know, in the pro wrestling world, a long blonde haired white meat baby face, you would get eaten alive, which I did. If you were kind of the, you know, the cool heel assholes, that's what people wanted to see. So it was funny to kind of watch how they were being portrayed in booking as heels, but so obviously baby faces in every way, shape, or form. I mean, Sting could barely hold on until he turned into the Crow Sting, which was a whole interesting thing. But other than that, I mean, Savage is Savage, so he was okay in Piper. But Luger, like none of those guys were really super popular as baby faces because the NWO was so all encompassing for the entire roster.
The NWO was really something that like the greater like media world, like the greater like masses wanted at that time, right? That was kind of like the attitude of the entire country. It was, you know, things
Right.
got a lot darker in the mid 90s compared to like the 80s or even the early 90s. And, you know, and I write about this in the book, I kind of owe that a lot to just what we were consuming as a culture. You know, I think like the OJ Simpson trial, you know, the Menendez brothers trial, like these are, you know, we're watching like one of the greatest athletes in the history of the country, like on trial every day. Like I was a kid watching this. It was the summer. My mom had it on every day on Court TV and we're watching it and they're talking about murders and they're talking about, you know, these horrible things. And like, you know, you're exposed. It's almost like, you know, the loss of innocence in the country. And I think, you know, that's the kind of thing that changes the culture and music change. You know, it became, you know, Nirvana and Marilyn Manson and gangster rap and like the anti-hero and like the villain was really very much in fashion. And, you know, the NWO was right there, you know, at the outset of that and rode the wave. And, you know, some could even say that they helped, you know, push that trend as well.
Chris, to kind of relate this to today's wrestling, because I'm interested in your thoughts on this, which is you mentioned the cool heel and stuff. Like it was so hard for WWE to get a babyface over until they got Cody Rhodes and did this long storyline. And now, you know, I think some people sense that maybe he won't be as popular, you know, months down the line, but still that story was fantastic. And then in the AEW side, someone like MJF, you know, very popular, also a heel. Seth Rollins is definitely a heel, but the crowd sings his song. Is this a change with the wrestling audience per se? Or is it just how people get over and then they sort of worry about the heel babyface thing later? Like, what do you think is going on today?
I think it's still always wrestling. Like I know, just for example, you're talking about the singing of the song. Like when I turned heel with the Jericho Appreciation Society, maybe there was a lot of like, well, how can you still use Judas as your song where people are going to sing it? So then when we start doing Learning Tree, I stopped using Judas specifically for that reason. And people didn't like it. It's not like they were booing more, but like you mentioned, it got kind of almost more indifferent in a lot of ways. So it's almost like wrestling is still entertainment. So if they're going to sing Seth Rollins' song, or if they're going to sing Judas and you're the most evil heel there is, that's okay because people just want to be part of the action. And I think in the 90s, one of the reasons to switch it back to NWO, why they were so popular is they had so much crowd participation. You mentioned, Hall's survey, the catchphrases that they had. I mean, Hogan playing guitar on his belt. I mean, I did that in Japan when I worked for WAR for years because it's so obnoxious and it's so freaking cool. Or suck it when you go into DX around the same time. Like all of these things that people could, ole, arriba la raza, like all these people in, Virginia that don't even know what Arriba La Raza means. Arriba La Raza. Like they're just saying it because it's fun. And nobody else could really tap into that until I turned heel. And then I was able to do it too. But it wasn't I think people just want to be entertained. And it's always easier to make people hate you than it is to make them like you. But once they start hating you, that's when they start to like you. And then if you turn babyface, all the stuff, John Cena, all the stuff that they liked about, hated about you, you know what I mean? Like they like you when you're supposed to be a heel. They hate you when you're supposed to be a baby face. And it's just, there's that weird kind of percentage in between where you have the sweet spot, but it doesn't last for very long.
I find it so interesting, like everything that you just said and just like wrestling as a whole and how, as performers, you kind of need to have your finger on the pulse of what people want, on a weekly basis, right? Like it's something that you have to tap into, like the zeitgeist. You have to have like you have to kind of know what's going on in pop culture and the way things are moving. And there's just no other medium like that. It's so fascinating to me because it's like if you're an actor on like on a weekly series or a streaming series, you're filming stuff like 18 months, 2 years before, and it's rolling out gradually on Netflix or Max or whatever, right? And you can't just adjust on the fly to what the audience is saying. But in wrestling, you can do that, and you can, and you've done that, Chris, right? Where you see where the wind is blowing sometimes, and you go in that direction, and it's incredibly compelling and captivating how you guys are able to do that. Where that just doesn't exist in any other medium.
But I once again, and you mentioned this, and that's another thing that nWo was really good at, was kind of incorporating what was going on in pop culture. Now, once again, here you have, three, I can't think of any more whiter guys in their mid 40s, but they're adapting to college, culture. I mean, Hall with the Tupac bandana. I remember you talking about the jeans that they wore.
Yeah.
The baggy jeans. I remember, do you guys remember FUBU shirts or FUBU brand?
Yeah,
I didn't know what that meant. I just remember all the nWo guys, including Hogan, were wearing FUBU. Luger's wearing FUBU. And Conan was always really, hip to what was going on in street culture. He's like, it's ridiculous they're wearing FUBU. I'm like, what is FUBU? It's for us, by us. It's urban culture. It's African-American culture. And here you got all these white guys wearing the FUBU shirts because that was the cool thing at the time. But they were very good in incorporating that into their act, which made them even cooler.
Yeah, and it was it's so interesting because hip hop, it feels like hip hop and rap and that world love pro wrestling. How many pro wrestling lyrics has there been, with rappers and entire songs about Ric Flair and so on and so forth. And it's just so, and I don't know if that stems from like the nWo embracing that world or where it really comes from, but I feel there's so many parallels I've been talking about before where wrestling is kind of everywhere. You see it. You're obviously an artist, Chris, in music, and the hip hop culture kind of runs parallel in many ways to wrestling culture. And I mean, I guess some people would say today in 2025 that what those guys were doing was cultural appropriation. But I gotta be honest with you. I don't and look, I don't want to speak for anyone, but it seemed like black folks were really, really into the nWo. So I'm not sure.
What it was though, also, it was the non-forced version of that culture. Cause you can go back to, you guys may remember WrestleMania 5 when they tried to bring Run DMC to do the and like the crowd did not want Run DMC there, right? It was kind of this forced thing. Then you may remember Mark. I don't know if you would remember him, but PN News in 1991 WCW. Okay, so you remember. Okay, so
WCW Worldwide when I was like 6 years old on TBS syndicated show. Absolutely.
Like this guy's never rapped in his life, and all of a sudden he's been given a rap gimmick. Men on a Mission. All of these like really forced things, and Hall and Nash kind of know what's out there or probably more so Hall is what I'm guessing, but they know what's working and they go, okay, we know that the kids are actually interested in this, and we can bring this a little bit more organically into the scene. But yeah, you're right. It is, it is three white guys, who probably, I don't imagine, Hulk was listening to rap music necessarily on a daily basis. Maybe he was trying to get something creatively from it, but like the fact that they did it in a way that made it cool, and some of the kids were like, yeah, this is what I listen to. This is what the nWo listens to. They must be cool. Like, that was so smart, right? It was absolutely smart.
Well, it's funny because I was, 26 years old, 27 years old. I was cool. But in that frame and in that world, not so much, because once again, you listen to the nWo music, and it's funny because I didn't realize this, Mark, but that came from the TBS sound files.
Yeah.
But so did my music. But my music sounded like this really watered down. The closest I can compare it is "Be Good to Yourself" by Journey. It's not even heavy Journey. It's really like this "Be Good to Yourself," ding, 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 ding. And it was just this cringy, terrible music from the Turner soundtrack. And I was like, fuck, why did I get that one? And they got this one. Like, even every way, shape, or form, nWo was just cooler than the average Joe in WCW, even though we were all 10, 15 years younger.
It was in doing the book, I was like stuff like that with just finding a random track in the Turner music library and having it be the nWo music. It feels like, and you could probably speak a lot to this, Chris, like it seemed like WCW was very fly by the seat of your pants, like just trying to make things work, not really having like a long-term plan for a lot of things, like just piecing it together as you went. And that's what it kind of sounded like. Even like the whole like rollout of the nWo, right? As Garrett mentioned before, it's like the Bash at the Beach happens, Hogan turns heel, it's massive, people are throwing stuff in the ring, they know they have something, but like the marketing team wasn't really looped into what was going to happen. Merchandise wasn't looped into what was going to happen. No one, PR wasn't, no one knew what the hell was what happening, and they found out watching the show like everybody else, and they were like, oh shit, we have to like start, mobilizing our resources, because this is going to be really big. We can make real money off of this. But they didn't have it. They didn't have a logo. They didn't have, they didn't have shirts. They didn't have anything. Now, WWE, AEW, like if someone comes in, a debut, or someone returns, boom, the shirt is up on the screen with a graphic before the end of the broadcast is over, right? That was not the case in WCW in 1996.
Ron Killings just came back after he was fired, and they had a T-shirt that said Ron Killings on it.
That's right. They weren't, the nWo guys weren't wearing the shirts like until like 6 weeks later on Nitro. That's how long it took to get to.
Well, that was the way it was back then. Nowadays too, you can have the graphic up and you don't have to buy any. You just print them as they're ordered. So, true. Back then you had to order your 400, wait 2 weeks to get them shipped in. Let's talk a little bit about the Hogan Bischoff dynamic, because I kind of was really interested in hearing, just how much influence Hogan had. Of course, we always knew that. But, it's the stuff that I get accused of sometimes of like, that doesn't work for me, brother. This really was a Hogan trait, which he used quite often in kind of pulling his creative control card, which nobody has anymore, ever. And I don't think they ever will have creative control anymore, just for this reason.
I really think, and I was talking about this with Garrett and Dave a few days ago on their show, that I really think that WrestleMania in Toronto in 1990 with Hogan versus Warrior, and Vince McMahon choosing to put Warrior over and having him at least attempt to be the face of the WWF. I think that really like messed with Hogan a lot, because Vince was a guy that he really had a lot of affection for, and he thought of as a friend. And I guess in his head, he just felt like, he was going to have the ball until the wheels fell off, essentially. And Vince was ready to make the change and have the Warrior be the face of the WWF, and Hogan did the job and everything, but he was really not happy with it. And then his feelings were validated, right? Because Warrior was obviously not the guy. So the title went back to Hogan. He became the guy again. He became the top guy in the industry once again. And I think a lot of what was happening in WCW, as far as his mindset, was informed by that. Worrying so much that at any point someone's going to try to knock me off like the top, away from the crown, so to speak. Right. And I think that kind of like the behavior, the creative control stuff, I really think that a lot of it stems from the fact that you know, as Hogan, a guy that I loved and who was my friend, Vince McMahon, he betrayed me in a certain way. I'm not going to allow that to ever happen again. I'm Hulk Hogan. I'm the face of the industry. I think that the business will be better as long as I'm the guy, right? You know, that's how he felt. You know, I'm very sure that's how Hulk Hogan felt. Like, you know, I'm still the guy. I'm drawing big money. You know, I'm the biggest draw in the history of the business, and everything works better when I'm on top. So just continue doing that for as long as you can. And if you look at like who he was wrestling, he was very particular about who his opponents were going to be, right? You know, he wanted to work with Macho Man a lot, right? So there was the heel turn, and then he's in the NWO, then he's not, you know, because Hogan wants to be across the ring from him. You know, he brings Warrior back in '98, right? The same thing with the Giant. The Giant is a guy that, you know, Paul White was a guy that Hogan trusted. He brought into the business, so he wanted to work with him too. So he was in the NWO, then he wasn't because Hogan wanted him as an opponent because he didn't want anyone else as an opponent. So you kind of see like, you know, as a kid, I'm watching this and I'm like, you know, I love this stuff. Now you don't know like kind of the inner workings of what's going on. But then when I watched it back, and I watched over 500 hours of WCW.
Wow.
That's a lot. But you start to realize, like, knowing what I know now about wrestling, it's like, oh, Hogan is like, he's being very specific about who he wants to work with. And it's very clear, right? You know, if you look at who his opponents were in that era.
I was going to say it's interesting too, like from being there. And once again, my perspective is different from you guys because I was there in the middle of it. Yeah. Even my very first appearance on Nitro, which I won by forfeiting a victory because Alex Wright hurt himself or something really dumb like that. The whole time they're talking about the NWO. And even in my first promo, the first time Chris Jericho shows up for whatever it's worth, I have to talk about the NWO. And Alex Wright has to talk about the NWO. The whole show was talking about the NWO or the NWO segments, or even if we were in the ring, all the commentators, Tony Schiavone and Zbyszko, they're just talking about Hall and Nash and what's going on. It's you probably noticed this, Mark. It's fucking infuriating for me watching all these great matches that we're having with some great performers, and they're not paying any attention to it whatsoever, which then tells the fans, oh, this isn't even worth watching. Don't worry about it. Let's just wait for the NWO. It was really counterproductive when it came to that.
Completely. And I watched everything, and I didn't just fast forward to the NWO segments, and the undercard was great. You know, you guys had an incredibly talented undercard.
Sure.
You know, and it's true. The commentary team was not discussing the match at all. They were discussing whatever was going on with the Outsiders or Hollywood Hogan or whoever, Sting. And yeah, I mean, it was fascinating to watch because like it was obvious that they made a massive commitment to get the NWO over, right? They made everything about the NWO, and it did succeed. They got over, right? But again, to the detriment of everyone else. And you know, when the time came for an adjustment to be made and for someone else to get elevated, someone else to get pushed, you know, the NWO to finally have like a chink in the armor or to take a loss or lose a title, there was no one with any credibility to actually do that, because they put all of their investment into the NWO and pushing them and as this unbeatable, unstoppable force. And then, everyone coming in was like, well, they have no chance because they haven't won. We've seen them getting beaten down for the last 5 weeks in a row, right? At the end of Nitro, they're getting spray painted. They're geeks at that point, right? So it was like one of those things where it was like, I mean, I know that you're getting heat, right? That's great, but at some point you need to have someone that the fans actually want to see win against the NWO. And that was very tough to come by until, like you said, Chris, they had, the whole Sting stuff where, he had to almost get darker than the NWO to become cool.
They were the ultimate boogeyman, the villain in the horror story. And you got to build them up bigger than life so that the fans see it as like the evil. But then by the time the good guy was supposed to win, politics, whatever you want. Mark has a nice chapter on how that ends with Sting and Bret Hart and the fast count or the non-fast count and who told Nick Patrick to count in what way. Like when you get to that thing at the end, then it's really about like protecting yourself, because in Mark's book, he says Hogan is very concerned about what he's getting out of Sting beating him. What's the next story for him? And Bischoff couldn't give it to him.
Right.
So that was part of the insecurity and part of the reason probably that thing did not go off as well as it should have.
Yeah, he's having like deja vu from 1990, like it's the Ultimate Warrior all over again. They're gonna put
Yeah.
the title on this guy with face paint, right? And there's no plan after that. And like Hogan's like, what does that do for me?
Once again, I want to talk about that because I would assume that's probably the first crack in the whole NWO armor. But leading up to that, business was through the roof. We did 6. I believe I'm paraphrasing. Dave probably knows the exact numbers, but 6 stadium shows basically in a row, from what I recall. There was New Orleans, there was St. Louis, there was San Antonio, there was Atlanta. It was one stadium show. Like Nitros were running in stadiums the way that WrestleMania does. Yeah. And once again, not with anything all that exciting on top. It was just, I always say that our undercard was amazing. Our top matches were not exciting, but they're NWO. WWE's top matches were amazing. Their undercard wasn't great. But for us, the NWO was drawing massively for the first year or so of their existence.
Yeah. It was the business was obviously great, all of 97. And then I would argue that creatively things were not as good in 98. And toward the end of 98, they were actively not as good, right? But business was still really good in 98. And this is something that I learned from knowing Dave Meltzer for so long, is that the business can sometimes lag behind the creative, right? And vice versa, right? So if creative is really good, it takes a little bit for the business to get going. And when creative drops off, it takes a little bit for the business to kind of catch up with the creative not being so good. And I think that's kind of what was happening in WCW in 98, where the creative was not as good. Things were not as compelling. The matches that the fans wanted were not happening. And business was still good, but you could see kind of a little bit of a decline here and there until it just fell off the table pretty much.
And not to give them the benefit of the doubt of what happened, but if you're thinking about it and business is hot, you're just trying to keep business as hot as humanly possible while you are running as fast as they were running. And Eric probably needed more help in that way, right? But he's in it. He's part of the act. He's part of what he believes is making this thing work. And something that Dave, every time I talk to Dave about this, about the NWO story, he always brings up that he and Bischoff would have these conversations. And Eric's mindset was, as long as we have Hogan,
right,
that's where wrestling is going.
Yeah.
And Dave would say, look, that has been the case in the last 15 years. However, there are these other guys on the other side who are getting really hot. Austin and Rock specifically is, I think, who they were talking about. And Bischoff was just like, yeah, but I got the guy who's the proven draw for, 20 years. And these guys might just be flash in the pans. And they were not, unfortunately, for WCW. But like, that was the mindset. And so I could see why some of those mistakes were made in the way that they were. Like, that the mentality was, Hogan, we have Hogan, we're going to win. And we're just going to try and recreate this thing, like the law of diminishing returns. Like, we're just going to create this thing. And then it just diminished completely.
Chris, do you remember, and a few people told me this in my reporting for the book, do you remember the speech that Bischoff gave at Nitro, where he said the only guys that can draw money in here are Hogan, Savage, and Piper? Because that took a lot of people off.
I believe it was in St. Louis at the TWA Dome, one of those. I could be wrong, but it was around that time. And I can honestly say there's 2 Bischoff meetings that I can remember that are talked about. And yes, he did say that. Hogan, Savage, and Piper. And I remember Flair was sitting there and Sting was sitting there and Hall and Nash were in there. I remember
Conan, who would sell out all of Mexico for many years,
I mean, and Conan for sure. But when you're fucking Flair is sitting right there,
okay, that's fair.
And Hall, it was a missile shot at Hall and Nash, because I think that was right when the X-Pac thing happened, where he got fired. And the other one that we don't have to discuss, but where he said he was gonna starve Flair and his family so that they have to live on the streets. That was in Minneapolis. He did say that as well. That's a whole other show too. But I also love how Bischoff a lot of times will say, I don't recall saying that, but I probably did. It's kind of a go-to line all throughout a lot of these things.
Yeah, like so he did a like a chat on Prodigy, and I think that probably the younger viewers will be like, "What the hell is Prodigy?" But it was an internet service provider at the time, and wrestling was pretty big on there, and there were like chats, and he did a chat on Prodigy in '98 right after the Waltman firing, and he pretty much admitted in the chat that it was a political move. Hall and Nash were, he wrote like, I brought Waltman in to appease Hall and Nash, and they were still acting like, assholes. So I fired him. That was like almost verbatim what he said in the chat. And I asked Eric about that, and he was like, well, I don't remember saying that, but
I don't recall.
I was blending like reality and and work a little bit, but I think that's how Hall and Nash felt about it. I mean, I know that's how they felt about it. They felt it was absolutely political, that it was another signal to them and to others that Bischoff was throwing in with Hogan, and Hogan was his guy, and he was going to continue to bet on Hogan so many times. And right after that, it's like Waltman is gone, and there's there's definitely infighting between especially Nash and Hogan. And right after that, the disciple, Ed Leslie joins the nWo with Hogan. It's like, how symbolic is that? Where it's like your best friend got fired, and now my best friend is right here by my side. I mean, that was the middle fingers up.
By the way, I did get I have the bat phone for Dave. He said 3 stadium shows in a month in WCW's best run.
So there you go. And I believe I just named them. I think it was San Antonio, St. Louis, and New Orleans. So there you go.
We need like Meltzer, like Chat GPT, where we can just like ask a wrestling question and it generates like the most encyclopedic answer. That would be incredible.
There's a great line
on that, Garrett. You're a tech guy. Can you work on the Meltzer GPT?
Yeah.
There's a great line when Waltman got fired. I don't remember if it was Hall or Nash. I'll attribute it to Hall. Either one. They were the same guy in a lot of ways. When Eric goes, Waltman is fired, and if you guys breach your contract, I'll send you to Siberia. And one of the two goes, it's okay, we're over in Siberia. But let's talk about where we think the kind of the initial, the beginning of the end, even though it was a while. Would you attribute it to the Starrcade Sting Hogan match, or was it prior to that?
I definitely think it was. I think things were. I thought '97 WCW was like great. I really enjoyed going back and watching all of that stuff. And then Starrcade it should have been like the climax to everything, the big blow off, right? You build Sting up for 16 months. He doesn't talk, he doesn't wrestle, and it's working, right? He's so over. He's like the most over guy in the industry, aside from maybe Stone Cold on the other channel. And you had this opportunity to really, kind of almost end like a part of the nWo story arc and put the belt on Sting. Like, that's what everyone wanted. That was the clear direction. If you know anything about pro wrestling, Sting has to win that match. And the way that it happened, and I guess he did win the match, but he certainly didn't come off looking very good in that match because of the count and all the shenanigans, right? So he came off looking bad. Hogan didn't come out looking good. Bret Hart came out looking terrible from that, right? Because it wasn't a fast count, and Bret Hart is out there to.
It was supposed to be a fast count,
right?
Sting loses by screw job. Bret comes out and says, "It's not going to be another screw job." Restart the match, but there was no fast count.
There was no fast count. And again, political stuff behind the scenes, Nick Patrick not knowing what to do because Hogan's telling him one thing, Bischoff's telling him something else, Sting's telling him something else, and he doesn't know what to do. He's caught in the middle. And then, that was bad, right? That was you lose a lot of credibility with the fans after that. But the follow-up, I would argue, guys, is actually even worse than the match. Because look, it's wrestling, right? Shit happens. You can fix it. There's a way that you can patch that up and make it make sense. They made it worse because the next Nitro, there was the rematch between Hogan and Sting, right? That was supposed okay, now for real this time, we're going to get it right. The show goes off the air before the match ends, and they don't play the finish until a week and a half later on the premiere of Thunder as a complete ratings ploy. So you're pretty much like after all this time of the nWo story where you're building this like credibility as far as like the story, the characters, the authenticity, and then you're just doing like phony wrestling stuff, right? Where you're doing ratings ploys and you're trying to you're kind of giving the FU to the fans, the ones that supported you and were locked in as far as like their investment right? And the time and the money they put in, and now you're just doing like, silly stuff like that. And I think that was almost worse. It was like, all right, you can fix Starrcade 97, but you can't, do the match the next night, have it go off the air, and then not show it until you're trying to get ratings for a new show. That was kind of messed up, honestly.
And they're also devaluing the title a little bit post Sting winning, because the more important and actually the money drawing programs was like Hogan and Dennis Rodman against Karl Malone and DDP.
Right.
And Goldberg would get the title, and then he would kind of be similarly, placed underneath whatever the headline thing was. And so, because you could have had the best of both worlds. The NWO is hot, then you get your babyface hot, and the NWO is trying to get the title back, and you have this great back and forth. But it was almost like, well, I'm going to show how much of a bigger star I am. So, and I'm going to be in these other programs that are actually going to draw more than the world title, and we're going to give Sting, Scott Hall or whomever. Like that's an interesting thing to look back as I was reading the book. And like Mark said, when you're watching as a younger person, you don't even really see any of that stuff. But then when you read and you have context, you're like, oh, there's reasoning for that. There's positioning stuff happening. There's contracts that are going to come up, and you want to show your value. So you get that increase, and you've got the war. And I remember reading some of the observers during this time period, and Dave is writing that, oh yeah, Hogan is looking at what kind of leverage he has to then get that big contract back in WCW. He's talking to, I don't know if it was to Vince or to people around Vince, just to kind of get a feeling of, oh yeah, okay, here's my value over there. Now what's my value here? So like all of those things, which are part of the business and a very important part of the business that you don't really see on television.
There's also another thing they didn't do, once again, speaking from my perspective, and that was move up some guys. Like you mentioned, you could have had Sting doing his world title and Goldberg's doing his thing, and NWO, who are they going to work? Well, how about Bret, Jericho, and Benoit? I mean, fuck, dude, it's right there. I know Bret even discussed it at one point. I mean, you got two guys that are ready to go. We're all from Calgary. We're all trained by the Harts. Bret is a Hart coming in with this, he had so much steam as a baby face. They just squandered it because of politics. But if you look at that, it could have been Sting on one side, NWO on another, Goldberg on another, NWO guys working with some new baby faces being created, led by Bret Hart, for example. I mean, that's a pretty good position for 1998 and WCW.
Bret Hart comes in, and he is the biggest baby face in the industry, right? He's so
baby face,
red hot and motivated because the other guy just screwed him over, right? So he wants to come in and win this battle,
and
right?
Essentially, in a lot of ways, his brother died because of them as well. That's another level.
And you have this guy who's red hot. He's one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, right? He's incredible. He's Bret freaking Hart. And, you debut him in the hokiest manner possible, right? As a referee for, Bischoff and Zbyszko in that match.
Terrible.
And then what do you do with him? And that was like one of the things that was really frustrating for me as I'm watching back. And then, the Wolfpack breaks off, and they were obviously extremely over, and they were going head to head with the NWO Black and White. And I felt like that was kind of like a little bit of the end of like the NWO story to an extent, because it no longer became we're trying to take over. Then it became just like, two groups like infighting a civil war. And the one thing, and I actually want to ask you this, Chris, because I have, and this isn't in the book, but I've thought about it, and it's kind of a theory that I have, and I want to run it by you. So it's the Wolfpack versus NWO Hollywood, right? The big blow-off match is what? It's got to be Hogan versus Nash, right? We never get that, right? That's the match that everyone wants. Hogan versus Nash, and then Hogan versus Bret Hart probably down the road would have been great. And then Hogan loses the title to Bill Goldberg. And I've always wondered, like, because Hogan obviously was very strategic about who he would lose to and how things would be positioned. And I have a little bit of a theory that because of what was going on in that time period with the Wolfpack and Hogan and Nash being at odds, do you think it's possible that Hogan said, screw Nash, I'm not going to face him or lose the title to him. I'm going to job to Bill Goldberg and give him the title. Do you think there's anything to that? Is that possible?
Here's what I think. And that could be possible because I know there were some personal issues. I not know for sure, but once again, I think it's been discussed when that stadium show was coming up in Atlanta and it sold so many tickets out of the gate. Hogan was so fucking smart that he knew that all of the Turner executives would be there. Once again, you mentioned earlier, Mark, what am I going to do to ensure the next contract?
Right.
Let me do the biggest match possible with no buildup, as we know, Hogan versus Goldberg in front of 50,000 people or whatever it was, and 1,000 of them are Turner executives, and 10 of those are the ones that pay his salary. Wow. Hulk Hogan drew 55,000 people in the main event for Goldberg and loses the title. Throw more money at him. That's what I think it was, more than maybe a Nash personality thing, because Goldberg was bigger than Nash was at the time. It was a brilliant move on Hogan's part to do exactly what you just said he was wanting to do, which is ensure the next contract.
And it's funny because like whenever you're doing, this stuff, and when you do interviews, and you always ask stuff like, and for my book, right, The Process, whose idea was that, who came up with that? And the answer back then was, it was just always Hogan, right? Because he had creative control, and it was obviously his idea to lose to Bill Goldberg. No one forced him to do that. No one had that idea. It was Hogan's idea, of course.
It's funny. I remember Dave used to write in the Observer, smartest man back then, smartest person in wrestling, and he'd have this list, and I always tell him, you got to bring this back. We got to see who's like the ones who are,
what and to piggyback on that, Garrett, one of the things I enjoyed about reading the book was it's kind of been forgotten, and it's something that I was told from day one. The most important thing in wrestling is the money and the miles, the business, making money. It's morphed, and people who don't like me are going to not like me even more for saying this. It's morphed now into having great matches in a lot of ways, having these 5-star, the bangers, the great matches. It's not about that. It's about making money. And that's what it's always been about. It's the wrestling business. And listen, good matches are important. Sure they are. But when I go back to reading about this, those guys kind of had it, in my opinion, a little bit more spot on, in that you need to make as much money as possible, and in a good way. It's if you make a movie, you want it to do $1 billion at the box office. Now there's great art house movies that lose money, but they're the best movies you've ever seen. They win an Oscar. That's great too. But business is business. And I really appreciated or was intrigued, shall we say, about how those guys were running that at the time. Like you mentioned, to make the most money possible with what they had going on.
It's funny that you said that, because I don't understand why there's like a stigma to say that it's about making money. Like, I don't know, why is that a stigma to say? Because what does making money mean? Making money means that you are giving the fans a product that they are willing to spend their money on and buy tickets and pay for pay-per-views. Why is that a dirty thing? Like, that's the point. Like, don't you want to serve the fans? Like, if you're making money, that means the fans are satisfied. So why is that a bad thing? It doesn't make sense.
And people walking around wearing Austin 316 shirts and nWo for life shirts that don't even really watch wrestling. It's like seeing a Kardashian wearing, a Slayer shirt. She's never listened to Slayer in her fucking life, or Ramones or Motorhead. It just becomes a thing. And it's like, I don't see the issue with that either, because that's kind of the concept of what a business is.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When I started doing the show with Dave, Wrestling Observer Radio, it was right around the time of New Japan, really hot in the US, the precursor to AEW. So, and indie scene was obviously really hot. So I got to see and talk daily about the business in that way. And so when you see AEW coming and you go, oh, this is not only the best thing for WWE, it is the best thing for the wrestlers, because now there are two companies who need talent and who need strong talent.
Right.
And they can, if you are in wrestling as a fan, I say this about other sports too. I think Tony Khan is awesome. He's like one of the nicest guys in his position that I've ever met. But I root for the wrestlers to their success, because that's who I'm watching. So when there was discussion about certain wrestlers going back and forth, and you see the one side of the fan base turn on them for going to the other side, and I'm saying no, this is good, because the best thing for WWE is that AEW is a good company, because then they'll be on their P's and Q's, and maybe a little bit overboard these days, but you want WWE to be good, you want AEW to be good, because the wrestlers will all make more money and they'll be able to perform longer and do the stuff that you like. When there is no AEW, then it's back to, from 2003 through 2020 WWE, which some people like those eras. I personally thought, it's just better when you have the competition, which goes back to why the nWo was such a vital piece of wrestling history, because they created this back and forth. WWE got their stuff together and they became what they were, but you needed the nWo and WCW to get hot for that stuff to happen. I think
the tribalism to me is so weird, because if you know anything about like the history of wrestling, the industry is at its healthiest when there is a competition. I mean, the territory days, people would come and go, and characters would stay fresh, and everyone was eating, so to speak, as the kids might say. And the tribalism stuff, like, there are people that are WWE fans that, like, just the sheer existence of AEW is like an affront to their sensibilities. It's like, why though? It's like, it's just wrestling. You don't have to watch it, but it's like, it's great that it exists, because like, is WWE thriving the way it is now if not for AEW pushing them? And I would argue no. The same way that in the 90s would Vince have made that adjustment to what ended up being the Attitude Era if not for WCW pushing him? And I would argue no. And that's competition. That is so good for the fans that hate it. They don't even realize it.
Yeah, and there's so much to talk about all this, but let me, as we start to wind down, let me ask about this. We're talking about the star power, and that of course creates money. We're talking, and once again, business wise, in this day and age, the television contracts are through the roof, but it still is and always has been a star power driven business. nWo comes in, it's huge. They start adding guys to the group, which then waters down the star power. Why did they do that? You mentioned the reason in the book, but let's kind of discuss that for a bit. How they started with 3 of the biggest names in wrestling, ends up with, I don't know, 15 with guys like Virgil and Brian Adams and God bless them all, but Michael Wall Street, like guys that are not main event players, so to speak, but they're still in the nWo.
There were a few reasons, right? One of them being that the nWo was so hot that the theory was that as long as someone from the nWo is on the house show or whatever show, that they're going to sell tickets. And Hall and Nash did not want to do every house show, so you needed someone representing the nWo, and that kind of led to some of those lesser names, I guess, joining the group. But also, we remember the nWo as something different than how they viewed it at the time. At the time, they were viewing it, Bischoff and WCW Brass, as something that could become its own show potentially. Something that could almost become its like own solitary promotion, just like the nWo on a Thursday night or whatever. And in order to do your own show, you need a cast of characters. You need mid-carders, right? You can't just have all main event guys.
Right.
Who's going to take a pin? It wasn't going to be Hall, Nash, and Hogan, right? So you needed mid-carders, you needed lower mid-carders, you needed guys that were going to be the role players, the utility guys. And that's how they were thinking about it. And then I think when Sold Out happened, that was when they realized, like, the nWo is like it's the opposition brand, right? It can't be its own thing, right? It doesn't work. It has to have like the foil, right? They are the foil. They can't be their own thing, because Sold Out was, you were there, Chris. It was not the greatest pay-per-view in the world. I think Dave's line from The Observer is like probably my favorite line in the entire book. I had to put it in, and it's like my favorite line in the book, and I didn't even write it. Dave Meltzer wrote it, but it was basically like, he said that Sold Out was like the equivalent of watching 3 hours of someone. Can I say this? Can I say this?
Of course. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay. He said it was the equivalent of watching someone masturbate for 3 hours, and I'm not sure if that's not what we just saw. And that was, and I just thought, that's going in the book. I don't care if they try to censor me. That's going in the book.
I worked with Chono at that pay-per-view, so it wasn't a total mess. Yeah. It's funny because I was actually one of the ideas at one point was for me to join the nWo when I won the TV title from Stevie Ray. Giant came down, who I think was in the nWo at the time. Giant came down and choke slammed Stevie Ray, helped me win the TV title. And I remember telling Bischoff, like, I don't want to be in the nWo, because at this point I was Chris Jericho, the paragon of virtue, and I had some steam going, and I was like, as arrogant as it sounds now, being just a dumb kid, I was like, I don't really want to join the NWO. He's like, why not? I was like, there's so many guys in there. I kind of got my own thing going. He's like, all right, fine. And I was like, so should the Giants still come down and help me win? He goes, yeah, sure. I go, but there's no reason for it. He goes, that doesn't matter. He goes, it doesn't matter.
I feel like so many people told me that told me that like Bischoff was like not even paying attention to like the mid card or
nothing
the card at all. And you know, it was really like you guys were responsible to just get yourselves over, and you did an incredible job doing that, because I felt like, you know, now watching, you know, your whole career, it's like it's very clear that you were just kind of doing your own thing, right? You were coming up with all your own creative, and you were pitching the ideas, and they were just like, all right, yeah. And you got over like that, but it's you know, you didn't have any kind of like, they weren't really behind you at that level, right?
I asked Eric, can I do a promo before the match? And he said, keep it short. So I do 30 seconds. And that's when I started with, I want you to want me, or the Gleben Glauten Globen, like whatever I thought was funny or stupid or whatever. And that 30 seconds led me to getting over, but they never paid any attention. He didn't care what I was doing. Didn't give a shit. Could care less. Yeah, just keep it short, 30 seconds. I could have went out there and said, go fuck yourself, Eric Bischoff, and WCW can suck a wiener or whatever, and he wouldn't have known, you know? Go ahead, Garrett.
Is that good, though? I mean, in a way, I mean,
it's not good. But it's not good. It's not good at all.
It's not good, but I guess what I'm asking is, like, you kind of had the freedom to do whatever you wanted, and you were good enough to get over. Not everyone could do that, but you were.
It's good for me. It's not good for the boss of the company to not know what's happening on his own show. Garrett, you gonna say something?
Fair enough.
I was just gonna say that my friends and I will still do the thing where you use the long version of somebody's name, so it's not Randy Orton, it's like Randall Orton. We still do that constantly.
Well, each other. I usually felt if it's entertaining me and I think it's funny, then maybe other people will too. So as we last few things, you know, like I said, we could talk for hours, and we should do another topic at some point, because this has been a good chat. But Mark, you mentioned that you talked to Kevin Sullivan, and then you also mentioned that Stevie Ray said he didn't want to do an interview. Did you talk to a lot of people in the book?
I did.
So who did you talk to? Who were some of the guys you spoke to about this?
I tried reaching out to Chris Jericho, but I was turned down for an interview. No kidding. I think I asked through AEW PR.
Oh, well, I never even heard about it. So
great, good to know. I talked to you know, I sat down with Eric Bischoff for I flew up to his home.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I sat down with him for, you know, many hours, and I spoke with Kevin Nash, not for as long as I wanted to. I wanted to go down to Daytona and chat with him for a bit, but he's had a really rough few years, so I certainly wasn't going to push him. Didn't talk to Hulk Hogan, but I feel like almost everyone else, you know, Scott Steiner, Buff Bagwell, a lot of like the mid-card folks. I even talked to like Ice Train, you know, Ernest the Cat Miller I talked to. I was trying to get everybody. And then a lot of like the behind-the-scenes folks that I spoke to, like the Neil Pruitts and like I remember Alan Sharp, the PR guy. You know, people like that, producers and engineers. Remember the engineer Ernie in the truck? Did you know him? He's like just the control truck guy.
Yeah.
Just people like that. Craig Leathers, who does not do many interviews. You know who my favorite interview was? Ellis Edwards. What a guy. Ellis Edwards. Really, I sat down with him in Atlanta for many hours, and he like I still can't believe that Sting did that every single week. Because that was so dangerous. It was so dangerous to do that every week.
He didn't have a cell phone. What was he doing up there for 5 hours before the show?
Having deep conversations. They were up there. They were up there for hours before the show, and then the whole show, and then like an hour after, because they had to like you know, take down all their stuff they had. It was pretty crazy. They had like a bucket where they had to like, you know, go to the bathroom up there. Like it was a very unique situation. I'm not sure how they did that every week. But Ellis is kind of an idiosyncratic guy, a little eccentric, so I can kind of see it.
I want to put over the book in this way as well. I have a journalism degree. It's a broadcast journalism degree, but Mark writing a book about wrestling, because Mark has real journalistic reporting chops. He's been reporting on MMA for years and years and years. Now he's reporting for the Atlanta Falcons. So like legitimate journalist. And his journalism, his skill set is throughout this book.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times you'll read books, and this is probably my issue with some of these biographers or some of these historians is they're like looking for stuff, and often they don't really have the context to what it is. So, you know, you're reporting on something 50 years ago and nobody's alive to talk about it. So how do you know? But Mark like was out there, like talking to people, pressing the flesh. And so you can see that in the book. There is a reporter's voice in the book on a story, you know, from years and years ago about wrestling. Like that's the most important thing, right? Like that journalism in wrestling is awesome. So I want to commend Mark for the work that he did on it.
Thank you so much for that, Garrett. I really appreciate that.
Last question, guys. Is there a favorite moment in the book that you guys can recall, or from the NWO history that you can remember from it?
I'll give you kind of like a under the radar moment for me when Eric Bischoff fires Randy Anderson, the referee, in front of his whole family.
I forgot about that. Yeah,
I thought that was I mean, again, under the radar, but you know, they was such a great segment because that was really his family, and Randy Anderson had just come back from battling cancer, right? He was in remission, and Bischoff fired him on national television, and people and I talked to Randy Anderson's his widow, the late Randy Anderson, and his son for the book, and they were so great, you know, to talk to about this, and that people really thought it was real. They were from Rome, Georgia, and you know, the folks back home in Rome were calling and giving their condolences. I'm so sorry that happened, because they were all watching, so much so that they were calling the Turner offices in Atlanta complaining that their beloved Randy Anderson, this great guy in the community, at the church, you know, who just came back from cancer, he got fired on national television by this asshole, you know, Eric Bischoff. And Harvey Schiller calls Bischoff down to his office and is like, "Did you fire someone on national television last night?" And Bischoff was like, "Well, you know," so like, it was just so. And I asked Randy Anderson's wife, his widow, and I was like, what do you say to those people who were giving you condolences? And she was like, I told them that it was just part of the show, that it wasn't real, but they mostly didn't believe me. They still thought it was legit.
How about you?
Job well done, I guess.
Yeah. How about you, Garrett?
My favorite part of the book, well, I mean, the intro is great when he lays out sort of the Hogan story. But my favorite part is the Rodman and Malone stuff. I'm a big NBA fan. And you actually have somebody stating in the book that they believe that Rodman and Malone were jockeying for position. And there's a moment in one of the games. They actually trip each other like 3 times. I remember watching this.
Yeah.
And that person thought that they did that to kind of subtly promote the WCW stuff. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it was Rodman's agent, Dwight Manley, who told me that.
That was an amazing story. They actually worked a fight in the NBA fucking finals
with Michael Jordan right, a few feet away. Like, how
wrestling each other. I love Dennis, and we had some great times after the show. And every time I see him, he's still always super friendly, and he's always very, very appreciative of his time in wrestling. My favorite story, and I love the story from my perspective, was the whole Jay Leno thing. Because once again, here we are in pop culture history where there's 2 of the biggest players having a fight in the NBA finals for wrestling. Bischoff and Hogan take over the fucking Tonight Show. The Tonight Show, the not just their version. Right. They went on NBC and took over the Tonight Show. And I remember when Jay showed up to do his match in Sturgis, he was great guy. And he, like you guys mentioned, he didn't do anything in the match. Didn't have to, whatever. The very beginning of the match, if you guys remember this, Hogan, I think he takes his arm, and then Jay takes Hogan in an arm bar. It's a very simple move. And Hogan stayed in this thing, and this is from what I remember, for like a minute. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, Jay's like a middle-aged, frumpy guy. Hogan's jacked to the gills for a minute. Next day, front cover of USA Today, which was huge at the time, Jay Leno wrestles match, whatever, and it's fucking Jay Leno has Hulk Hogan in an armbar on the front cover of the USA Today. And I was like, that is one of the most genius things I can never think of. And I didn't even have to say anything to Hogan. Years later, I mentioned, he's like, yeah, show business, brother. I mean, well, yeah, I had to make sure they all took the pictures, but I knew it. That's why he stayed in the hold for that long, so everyone could take the picture. And it's on the front cover of USA Today, which once again shows how huge WCW and the nWo was at the time, to be on the front cover of the paper that everyone sees that they got every morning. So what a tremendous time for wrestling. And your book is a tremendous memory and documentation of that, Mark.
Thank you so much. And I actually talked to Jay Leno. I interviewed the producer of the Tonight Show, Garrett, and at the end of the call, I was like, hey, if you're still friends with Jay, maybe, just pass him my number. And you guys know, like, that never works, right? That never works. Right. Anytime you ask that, it falls on deaf ears. But literally 3 days later, I get a call from an unknown number on my cell phone, and I pick it up. And it's like, hey, this is Jay Leno. I'm like, of course it is. I know your voice. You're freaking Jay Leno. I know what your voice sounds like. That was crazy. I crapped my pants. But he was great. He said that just a few weeks before we spoke, someone saw him on the street in LA and was like, remember, WCW, you wrestled Hulk Hogan. You really couldn't stand that guy. And Leno was like, what are you talking about? It was all an act. It was all, he's my friend.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? And the guy was like, no, you really were mad at him.
That one was real. I know that one was real.
Exactly.
Well, guys, this was great. And once again, like I said, if we ever have another topic, we'll have to do it again, but I appreciate it. And once again, great job, Mark, and great talking to you face to face, Garrett.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it, man.